Let us now focus on some interpretations of this verse that take into account the context of the time of the revelation of the Qur'an. For some Muslim scholars, the key to understanding chapter 4 verse 34 of the Qur'an and the issue of violence against wives is based on coming to terms with the social and historical context in which the verse was revealed. I refer to those scholars who look at closely the social and historical context of the Qur'an in interpreting it as contextualist. This is not an entirely modern phenomenon. We have examples of this in the tafsir or Quranic interpretation, particularly in the case of interpreting legal verses. Early Muslim scholars attempted to understand why and under what circumstances a particular Quranic verse was revealed in order to have a better understanding of that verse. Approaches to interpretation of the Qur'an that take into account such factors can be described as contextualist. As the name suggests, a contextualist approach to the Qur'an uses the circumstances and context in which revelation occurred, so the purpose of the verse can be determined. This also will help us in making a distinction between universal principles that apply to all times and specific instructions that apply to particular situations. It is not possible to analyze or interpret the Qur'an without necessarily looking at the life of the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet's life and teachings, which are referred to as Sunnah, are a living example to Muslims of the purpose and message of the Qur'an. Thus, when doubts arise about the purpose or true meaning of a verse, it is useful to study the example of the Prophet's behavior. What exactly did the Prophet do in relation to a particular verse? How did he behave in relation to that? On the issue of violence or the use of violence against one's wife, the Prophet Muhammad once said, "Can any of you beat his wife as he would beat a slave, and then lie with her in the evening?" The Prophet never struck any of his wives. This is very important. If the Qur'an was giving a license to Muslim men to beat their wives, why did the Prophet prohibit such violence? Why didn't he himself beat his wives? Many contextualists analyze the specific time and events surrounding the revelation of particular verses. Fatima Mernissi, a contemporary Moroccan sociologist and a Muslim feminist, argues, based on classical Muslim commentators of the Qur'an such as Tabari, that the Qur'an chapter 4 verse 34 was revealed in response to an incident concerning a woman who was beaten by her husband and went to Prophet Muhammad for arbitration. She wanted to beat her husband in retaliation. Mernissi argues that it was Prophet Muhammad's original intention to fulfill the woman's request for retaliation against her husband. However, before he had a chance to order this, God decided otherwise and revealed this verse. So the Prophet Muhammad said to her, "I wanted one thing and God wanted another." Of course, Mernissi is relying in her opinion on classical commentators, as I said early on. Amina Wadud, an academic I referred to early on, also takes a contextualist approach to understanding chapter 4 verse 34. She acknowledges that the Arabic word daraba in the verse does mean to hit. However, She believes that this verb was deliberately chosen over the more extreme, intense or extreme form of the verb, which would mean to hit repeatedly or intensely. Here she is getting into Arabic grammar and linguistic analysis. Amina Wadud argues that the reason for this was because in Arabia, before the coming of Islam, women were regularly exposed to excessive violence. Instead of prohibiting violence towards women outright, she believes that the verse was revealed to ban unchecked violence against wives. However, this should not be understood to mean that the Qur'an sanctions domestic violence. According to Wadud, the verse was to serve as the first step towards reform, as a means of slowly phasing out the practice of violence until it was eradicated completely. So it is a reform. Other scholars also have argued that in the culture of Arabia at the time, women suffered this kind of abuse and violence quite often. The Quran is strongly advising Muslims to stay away from violence, as many pre-Islamic Arabs were accustomed to, and to use other means such as talking, discussion, staying away from sexual relations to solve problems. In a society where resorting to violence against women was common, it is saying that such violence should be avoided. One of the most important implications of taking a contextual approach to interpreting the Quran is that verses such as this one can be reinterpreted as social and historical contexts change. Even if one takes the meaning of the phrase وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, translated as and beat them or and hit them, it may be because of the prevalence of use of violence, the Quran was not able to prevent violence entirely at the time, but it was taking the first step of eradicating the use of such violence by suggesting alternatives to violence and permitting only a symbolic form of hitting as a last resort. As we know, many Muslim scholars, both early and modern, argued in interpreting this verse that if one has to hit, he has to hit only symbolically by using something like a small piece of cloth or a traditional toothbrush called miswak in Arabic, and should not cause any pain. This interpretation also demonstrates that many early and modern Muslim scholars were not taking this phrase literally, as some Muslims do today. In understanding this verse, let's put together a number of things. The Prophet's actual practice, that is, he never hit any of his wives, with his well-known distaste for violence against women, and his frequent advice to Muslims that they should treat their women gently, with this verse, with what this verse is saying. Let's then interpret the verse in the light of all of this, and when we do so, we cannot use the verse to justify violence against women. While violence against women may have been a norm and practice in 7th century Arabia, this should not be the case today. The Quran was revealed in a particular context, and many Muslims argue it needs to be understood in this context. The Quran emphasized that both men and women come from the same person or nafs, that marriage is not a form of slavery for the woman, and both the man and woman have rights over the other. It strongly urges Muslims to treat each other fairly, gently, and justly. It has many texts throughout that emphasize these meanings.